We've just seen a big jump in infections and deaths in Wuhan. Do you believe the Chinese government has this situation under control?
Well, consistent with what I was just saying, Patricia, the bottom line is the scientific community, both within China and abroad, are still seeking to come to grips with the exact nature of the virus itself. This leaves to one side the whole dilemma of developing an appropriate vaccine. So because of that inherent uncertainty, I think there will continue to be a question mark about the ultimate success of the containment measures being deployed by the Chinese government. Again, having said that, the quarantine measures which the Chinese government has ruthlessly imposed across the country are formidable by any global standard, and whatever criticisms you may level at the Chinese government or party for a range of reasons, I don't think anyone is challenging the effectiveness and the draconian nature of the quarantine arrangements that have been put in place.
The outbreak is forecast to wipe 0.5% off Australia's GDP in the March quarter. How significant a hit is this to our economy in your view?
I think it's real. I've been saying for quite some time now that there seems to have been some general complacency both in this country and in other parts of the world about the potential economic impact of this virus on our respective economies. You know the numbers as well as I do, Patricia. When we looked at SARS, from memory, the Chinese economy represented about 4% of global GDP. Now we're looking at an economy which is approaching 17 or 18% of GDP and rising. As a consequence, its feed-in factor to economies in the Asia-Pacific region, which are deeply embedded in the Chinese economy, like our own, is huge. So this has been, I think, an unfolding reality for anyone with eyes to see for the last several weeks. I think it's been a little late in coming in some of the final conclusions reached in Australia. It's real, it'll be lasting, and I doubt whether we're going to see a full return to economic normality in the Chinese economy until we get closer to mid-year.
The Chinese economy took a big hit from the trade war. It's carrying a lot of debt and now it's had to shut down for weeks. What kind of fallout should we expect? You say till mid-year, but what are the kind of consequences of that for the Chinese economy as well?
Well, if you look at the unfolding challenges to Chinese growth in the last period of time, they kind of fall into three boxes. One, there's been what I describe as problems in China's overall economic policy settings for the last 2 years, a greater preferencing for the Chinese party and state over the private market and entrepreneurs. And as a result, for a year or two now, we've seen a slowing in private fixed capital investment in China. Then you roll in on top of that the material impact and the confidence impact of the trade war, which began 18 months ago, for which we've had a Phase 1 agreement signed in Washington last month. But still, protections in place through tariffs and most of the US-China trade, and we still have a very uncertain trajectory for Phase 2 of that overall trade dispute. And now thirdly, we've got coronavirus. So if you put all these things together, the economic authorities in Beijing are deeply concerned about the real impact on Chinese growth. There were signs of small recovery in China late December, then coronavirus hit, and we are now back in quite a deeply serious situation. So I think we should steel ourselves for seriously negative numbers, but building on SARS, let me finish on this, Patricia. What happened with SARS is that once it hit, and the economy took a huge hit in the first half of 2003, there was a big recovery in the second half, aided by a huge level of Chinese government stimulus. I think that's what's likely to happen again this year. First half bleak, second half you'll see the throttle being put to the floor.
In the early weeks, we saw relatively free reporting on the outbreak. It's since emerged doctors trying to raise the alarm were silenced. How open do you think Beijing has been with the world after those reports?
To be honest, Patricia, it's impossible to tell. You just referred to the tragic death from the coronavirus of Dr. Li Wenliang, the young 34-year-old physician at the hospital in Wuhan, the center of this virus outbreak. And if you look carefully at the case associated with himself, before he died, he photographed the charge sheet he'd been given by the local security authorities for daring to speak out and spread rumours. Now, frankly, that has just set off what I describe as a social media riot in China itself through the Chinese equivalent of Twitter called Weibo, as people are saying, hey, this guy was actually doing his job and he got crushed locally, and on the way through he caught the virus and now he's dead. So that's the case study which has focused the minds of people at home and abroad about transparency of data. I cannot externally, in all confidence, tell you how good and reliable the data is that we're seeing from the Chinese authorities today. It's not in their interests, however, ultimately to lie about this, because something like a virus with a significant mortality rate ultimately produces its own evidence on the streets.
And just finally on that theme before we move on, are you worried about a rise in xenophobia and racism towards Chinese people, particularly here? Obviously, we're talking in our domestic framework in Australia as well.
I am. What has worried me so far about the Australian government's response, as I've seen it, to be quite honest, is this. This virus became, as it were, a central feature of international news from sometime in the middle of January. So far, we've seen very few expressions of genuine solidarity, sympathy and support from the Australian government to the Chinese people, because first and foremost, whatever we think of China's political ideology, this is a humanitarian crisis of massive proportions. And that doesn't help when people, frankly, in China itself, are fearing for their lives and human safety. Put yourself in the minds of a family living in Wuhan today, just dealing with day-to-day lockdown and uncertainty. I think the second thing I'd say is when you look around the world, and it's not just here in Australia, I have seen some evidence, and stories have been reported to me, of what are plainly racist reactions against Chinese people themselves. I don't think that helps in any way deal with the objective challenge of the virus, let alone does it help in terms of preserving the social fabric in a country such as ours, which, remember, has been very happy to take tens of billions of dollars in export revenue from visiting Chinese tourists and visiting Chinese students for the better part of a decade now.
Are you concerned about the treatment of Chinese students? There were reports about border force and some rough treatment at the start of the ban. Are you concerned about those stories and the ramifications for that industry?
Well, I'm always concerned about anything that Minister Dutton puts his hands to be quite honest. Minister Dutton has had a long history of, frankly, dealing with race-related questions in Australia with less than what I would describe as appropriate sensitivity. Whether it's on Indigenous matters or whether it's on questions concerning ethnic minorities in this country. And I suppose the question I'd like to hear Mr. Dutton answer is simply this. If, for example, the dual nationals we were rescuing from this virus happened to be Brits or happened to be Americans, would he have been so quick to lodge them on Christmas Island and to mining camps outside of Darwin? I don't think so, because the bottom line is you could secure quarantine facilities in a range of other places closer to, let's say, civilization in Australia. So I'm always concerned when Mr. Dutton puts his hands to these questions. He's always got the Hansonite constituency well and truly in mind.
So if you were still Prime Minister, you wouldn't have sent them to Christmas Island?
I would have taken the advice from the medical authorities. I'd love to see publicly released the menu of options handed to Mr. Dutton from the medical authorities outlining where these folks could have been quarantined. I don't object at all to the nature of quarantining. That would be, I presume, the professional advice from the medical authorities. I would be fully compliant with their advice, but I would like to see the menu of options that they were presented with and why it was that Mr. Dutton chose these two particular options and what he would have done had we been dealing with white people with a virus as well. I leave that, and I look forward to his answer at some stage.
The US is stepping up freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. The senior US commander in the region has told Sky News that he held talks with the Prime Minister. Should the government be involved in those?
If you're talking about freedom of navigation operations, the position of successive Australian governments has been to support freedom of navigation in all seas around the world. Now, because I'm no longer in the intelligence loop, nor am I in the National Security Committee of Cabinet's decision-making loop, I don't know what request has been made for what particular operations where. So I would simply say this in response to your question, Patricia. Yes, I fully support freedom of navigation. I fully support the concepts of FONOPS, freedom of navigation operations, but I don't know the details surrounding these most recent requests or recent operations by the Americans. It would be foolish of me to comment.
Just on this debate we're having around carbon credits and climate change in this country and internationally, you say some EU countries are actively considering climate tariffs against Australia. Which countries?
No, what I've said recently is the European Commission was considering this. That's the entity which actually forms the administration in Brussels on behalf of the entire European Union. So I'm not pointing to a particular country. I simply know from my own sources that these are matters under active consideration in Brussels as they look forward to the future of the climate change action regime globally, and which countries are lifting their weight and which countries are not. And frankly, the world has concluded that Australia under the Morrison government is not lifting its weight one bit.
Why are they singling out Australia given there are many countries that aren't on track to meet their Paris targets?
Look, I haven't probed the depths of EU thinking on this. What I was reflecting in that interview the other day on remarks I made at the Committee for the Economic Development of Australia was what I'd heard from Brussels itself. If I was to speculate, it would be to do with two things. One is the abysmally low greenhouse gas reduction targets that the Australian government has committed itself to. And number two, most particularly, the spoiling role which Australia played at the most recent Madrid meeting of the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change in December last year. And that spoiling role had a lot to do with what you referred to before. That is, this unilateral decision by the Morrison government to use so-called carbon credits to reduce its effective future obligations. For your viewers, Patricia, a carbon credit seeks to take, as it were, overperformance in the past on the modest targets we set for ourselves over the previous decade, and in fact overachievement largely during our period in office. And the Morrison government's decision unilaterally to take those credits and apply them to the 2020-2030 period under the agreements stipulated for the Paris Treaty. That's what the world's objected to, because it's not what anyone else is doing. And secondly, if everyone else did it, for God's sake, you'd end up having very large-scale emitters drawing on some 13 billion tonnes of carbon credit equivalent to apply to the new period, and the planetary consequences of that would be appalling.
There is a report that the government's been enjoying taunting Labor over today about a meeting of a so-called group called the Ottis Group. People like Don Farrell and Joel Fitzgibbon wanting to talk about coal and, challenging Labor on the right, not wanting Labor to move to the left too much. Some of those names would be very familiar to you, Kevin Rudd, Don Farrell in particular, given your history and your own removal as Prime Minister. What do you make of that group meeting and agitating on issues around coal? I know Anthony Albanese is a friend and an ally of yours. Should he be watching his back?
I've got to say, Patricia, some things no longer surprise me in Australian politics, but hearing about this one in this interview is kind of novel. I'm sorry, I just don't even know what the story is. That's Probably my fault, I'm sorry.
No, it's probably healthy for you, but I do think it's been dominant here today, and I think it is worthy of asking, because some of those names, as I say, Don Farrell is a name that is familiar to you, I know. Some of these people who you described as faceless men meeting to talk about coal, it was seen as a way of kind of pushing the party on those issues. I know that you have always argued that Australia and the Labor Party should have strong climate change credentials and take strong action. What do you make of that? Should Anthony Albanese be worried?
Well, the first point I'd say, in all honesty, Patricia, is I don't even know what the story is, point one. Point two is, if there's a, quote, disunity question alive here, I mean, let's just call a spade here. Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister of Australia, was turned out of office by his own party, by Morrison and Dutton's mob, over climate change. That actually affected the highest office in the land. Secondly, you see these extraordinary splits now emerging in the National Party, where again climate change is the internal factor at work. As Barnaby Joyce from Climate Change Denial Central Casting tries to reassert his mediocre populist face into the centre space of Australian politics. So they're the government, the National Party is split, the Liberal Party has been split. You've seen Liberal Party backbenchers from inner city areas breaking ranks with Morrison's government over climate change action. That's the stuff I'm familiar with, not who's having lunch at or dinner at a restaurant somewhere in Canberra. I actually don't know anything about it.
Yes, those dinners in Canberra, they're all too familiar. Just finally, before I let you go, yesterday we saw the final Closing the Gap report under the strategy that you put in place. Just 2 of the 7 targets are on track. Why do you think progress has been so limited under successive governments?
Well, actually, this is the reason I agreed to do the interview, Patricia, to talk about closing the gap. It's
well,
the 12th
lucky I asked then.
It's the 12th anniversary, so let me just say 1 or 2 things about something near and dear to my own heart. The key thing is this. Of the targets we've set, we are, as you know, on track to achieve targets on Year 12 retention rates for Aboriginal kids and also for preschool education for littlies from Indigenous communities across the country. And the other targets that have been set, even Mr Morrison admitted yesterday that we are better in terms of the measures and what's been achieved 12 years later than we were back then, but we've still fallen short of the targets that we've set. So my first real core argument is this. Would we have achieved any of this progress, including the 2 targets we're on track to achieve, if it wasn't for the National Closing the Gap strategy? That's something which Mr Morrison glosses over. And one other thing is, what I really worry about, having just read Mr Morrison's speech from yesterday in Parliament on Closing the Gap, is what Mr Morrison is now doing, it strikes me, is as follows. He's delegitimising the targets contained in the original Closing the Gap strategy, saying they were over-ambitious, imposed by white fellas like me, when the reality is we took the whole idea of closing the gap from a 2005 report by Tom Calma, the then Social Justice Commissioner for the Aboriginal community. And secondly, these were not hugely ambitious targets. They're hard, given the level of entrenched disadvantage we've seen in Indigenous communities. But if you pull funds from out of doing this stuff, as the Abbott government and its successors have done since 2013, what do you expect? It's going to be harder to achieve the targets which were laid down in the first place.
So you feel like the critique about the ambitious strategy is unfair, because one of the arguments he makes is that it wasn't developed with the equal buy-in of Indigenous people. He says they should be at the table, and that's part of his overhaul. Do you think it's a fair critique?
That's absolutely false. It's false because, as I said, Closing the Gap itself was based on a 2005 report by Tom Calma, the then Aboriginal Social Justice Commissioner. We didn't pull it out of space, that's where it came from. Jenny Macklin, who became the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, then worked with Indigenous leadership to develop those targets. Secondly, however, the key thing is this. If you are going to achieve those outcomes, then you must have long-term sustaining funded programs. That was the case until 2013. The first budget the coalition brought in 2014 wiped out $500 million worth of funding to the Closing the Gap strategy nationwide. So you ask me, is this a problem of the targets, or is it a problem of defunding of the programs to realise the targets? What worries me, Patricia, is this, that what we see is a very clever piece of politics by a fairly clever politician, Mr Morrison, who's learnt a lot from John Howard, I think, which is delegitimise Labor's targets, say we're going to have new targets, I suspect without as rigorous measures as we've had in the past, and that enables us to wriggle out from under in terms of future funding commitments and accountability, and we'll flick past the rest of the states. I suspect that's the real strategy behind yesterday's statement.
Kevin Rudd, thanks for joining me.
Good to be with you.